Before I get into anything technical, I want to set expectations for this video. This is my first time using Higgsfield AI, and instead of doing a polished highlight reel, I wanted to show the actual creative process, the thinking, the trial and error, the moments where something doesn't quite land, and how I work through that. I'm creating a short cinematic sequence from still images, moving them into motion, and incorporating atmosphere and sound by using groundbreaking audio models. So this isn't a tutorial, and it's not a final film breakdown either. It's more like an honest walkthrough of how I explore a tool as a creator. You'll see how I build images, how I refine them, how I organize assets, and how ideas shift along the way, because that's just part of making anything meaningful. I always start visually. Before I think about story or structure, I want to understand the texture of a world, the lighting, the realism, the emotional temperature of the image. For these initial image generations, I'm using Nano Banana Pro, which is one of the image models available here. I wanted something that leaned into realism and texture rather than a stylized or illustrative look, and this felt like the right place to start for a cinematic sequence. So here, I'm generating my very first frame. I'm not overloading the prompt, and I'm not trying to be clever yet. I just want to see what the system gives me to respond to. What immediately stood out to me was how grounded everything felt. The lighting, the materials, the sense of place. It already felt cinematic rather than illustrative, which is something I really care about. At this stage, I'm not trying to perfect anything. I'm deliberately moving forward instead of looping too early, because sometimes you need momentum before refinement makes sense. Once I had a frame that felt right, I started using it as a reference image for the next generation. This is where things get interesting because reference images are really what help lock continuity, not just in character, but in atmosphere and tone. I tested a few approaches here, using one reference image, using multiple references, and generating without references at all. Just to compare, one thing I noticed early on is how sensitive the system is to detail. For example, in one iteration, water droplets appeared that didn't make sense for the scene at all, and that immediately broke immersion for me, so I removed that element and regenerated, keeping everything else consistent. Small details like that matter more than people think. While previewing results, I also want to mention a small UI tip I appreciated. You can move through images using the arrow keys, and you can see exactly which reference images were used for each generation inside the preview. That made comparing variations much easier. Once you start generating more than a handful of images, organization becomes essential. I created folders for this project so I could separate experiments from actual candidates for the film. I like keeping random tests and polished assets completely apart. Otherwise, things get messy fast. One limitation I noticed is that you can't generate inside a folder. You generate first, then organize afterwards. That's not a problem for me personally, but it's worth being aware of as your library grows. Another small thing that helped was adjusting the gallery scale and browser zoom. I ended up working at around 90% zoom, just so everything felt a bit more breathable visually. These are tiny workflow choices, but they add up over time. This is the part I think matters most, and it's something I don't see talked about enough. Partway through this process, I realized the original story I had in mind wasn't quite landing. The images were beautiful, but emotionally, something felt off. Instead of forcing it, I pivoted. I went back to an older prompt I'd used previously, one that I already knew carried a stronger emotional pull, and instantly, it clicked. This image became my hero frame, and I want to say this clearly. Changing direction doesn't mean the earlier work was wasted. Everything I'd learned about the UI, the references, the tone, all of that still applied. I just redirected it into something that felt more honest. That's what real creative work looks like most of the time. With the direction locked, I started refining more intentionally. Upscaling was very straightforward to find and use, and all upscaled images automatically appear in the Assets section, which kept things tidy. I paid close attention to repetition in background figures, overcrowded compositions, anything that felt uncanny or overly perfect. Some variations were technically impressive but emotionally flat, and those went straight into the no pile. I'd rather have something slightly imperfect that feels alive. One thing I'll say here is that the UI feels intuitive in a way that makes exploration enjoyable rather than overwhelming, and that matters a lot when you're working creatively for extended periods. Once I had my final images selected, I moved into motion. For these motion passes, I'm using 2.5, which works really well for subtle cinematic movement, things like fabric motion, environmental shifts, and gentle camera drift. I experimented with a few different motion prompts, and what surprised me most was how effective simpler prompts often were. When I tried to over-direct complex elements, like gates or multiple moving parts, the results were less natural. But when I focused on subtle movement, atmosphere, and camera feel, things clicked. The same applied to sound, particularly ambient audio, rather than dialogue. For this, I'm using Kling 2.6 audio, which allows motion and sound to be generated together. Instead of speech, I focused on environmental detail, things like wind, distant movement, and room tone, so the audio supports the atmosphere without distracting from it. Speech generation is interesting, and I tested it briefly.
This letter holds everything I've been waiting for. I can hardly believe what these words mean.
But for this piece, atmosphere felt more authentic. Overall, this experience genuinely exceeded my expectations. The process felt fluid, intuitive, and flexible enough to support real creative decision-making, not just output generation. What I appreciated most is that I never felt boxed into one way of working. I could explore, pivot, refine, and trust my instincts without fighting the interface. This video was about the process. The finished cinematic short will stand on its own, and I'll be sharing that separately. But if you're someone who cares about storytelling, mood, and visual continuity, this kind of workflow feels very natural. And honestly, this is just the beginning of what I want to explore here.